art platform India that we started in September this year. This is a collective of galleries. The idea is to connect, collect, and to engage. So the TAP Talks and TAP Live are part of our programs to engage with all of you. And I do hope you're going to enjoy this evening. Well, this evening is going to be very, very exciting because we are stepping out of India and into the global arena with both Boon Hui Tan and Priyanka Mathew. So to tell you a little bit about the talk before I introduce both our speakers, the talk is about the journey of Asian art and what is happening and what has happened in Asia and what is happening in India and how we in India relate to what's happening in Asia and how, history repeats itself. And this entire journey that the Asian market has been through is something that we in India are also following in a different way, but with a lot of similarities. So Priyanka and Boon Hui are going to tell us all about what has happened, what is happening, what we should expect from India. And as I was planning the talk with Priyanka, it sounded so exciting that I wanted both of them to give us the talk while we were planning it. But here it is for all of you. So to introduce everybody, so let me introduce Boon Hui Tan first. Boon Hui Tan is the founding artistic director and co-curator of the Inaugural Asia Society Triennial. He was formerly the vice president for global arts and cultural programs and director at the Asia Society Museum in New York, which led the organization's global arts and cultural activities spanning visual arts, performing arts, literary arts, and film. Earlier to this, he was with the Singapore National Heritage Board, and before that, he was director at the Singapore Art Museum. He was also one of the founding members of the Singapore Biennale. He was one of the founding members of the Biennale Foundation, and he was responsible for putting the curatorial angle into the Singapore Biennale, which now has become a very important Biennale for those of us in Asia. And to introduce Priyanka, she's had a very interesting life. So she's, I think, the perfect person to lead us through this journey of what's happening in India. Because Priyanka was first with Lehman Brothers and then with Goldman Sachs as an investment banker. So she knew all about the commercial world before she joined a gallery in New York and worked with them for close to a decade. So she really got to know the insides of how the gallery system works, and then moved on to Sotheby's as the consultant and the head of Asia in Sotheby's. So you know what it opened up for her and for all of us. So to have Priyanka plan this talk for us was really exciting because she has a range of experiences that she brings to this conversation and puts us all gives us a great perspective, I'd say, of what to expect and what is happening, and an outsider's point of view, but yet with a complete understanding of the inside. Am I right, Priyanka? So come on, join us, Priyanka and Boon Hui, and let us get on with it. I don't want to take too much time. And thank you so much, both of you, for giving us the time and accepting to do this.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I just wanted to, before your onset, just congratulate and thank every gallerist that is a part of TAP. What an incredible initiative. It's this kind of, synergies between galleries and a united way in which to promote art that's going to make the difference. And it's really wonderful and exciting to see how TAP is developing. I'm very excited to speak to my, now I can call him my dear friend, Boon Hui. We have traversed, I feel in some ways, a pandemic together here in New York. He moved to New York 5 years ago. And have had many conversations about the changing state of the art world, which is what precipitated the idea to share some of our insights, or frankly, mostly his, with you all. The pandemic has been very disruptive to every ecosystem, industry. That it's made winners and losers, and it's really kind of speared on fundamental change. And fundamental change in the art world. We've seen a lot of people moving online, but it's also done something to kind of reorganize, in a sense, sort of the art ecosystems. And that's what we're going to explore. I have been long fascinated with China, and just in the way that China has been the sort of the art, the country and the art ecosystem that has developed in a very unique way, but is closely nipping the West in terms of sort of volume of art that's sort of put out, and engagement. We're really seeing a lot of activity from there. So I thought a good place to start was Boon Hui, to give us kind of like the cliff notes, the 101 about how you and I have spoken, and you had mentioned, like, there was no ecosystem until very recently, and some of this has developed very quickly. Could you just kind of take us through how China has got to where it is? I know it's a big question, but maybe you can do a short version.
Yeah, thanks, Priyanka. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Sharon, for that very kind and generous introduction. And thanks to TAP and everybody here who've taken time out from dinner or breakfast in New York, and maybe lunch if you're calling from London, to be on this. I mean, I think I see this more as a conversation and a sharing of ideas, since we have such knowledgeable and experienced people here at this gathering, and I'm looking also at the list of participants. I think a lot of this, we're talking about this morning, well, in New York this morning, came from, the various, as the pandemic hit, the various kinds of conversations and sparring that I had with other colleagues in the art world, especially including Priyanka here, not about any specific scene, but about, what has been happening in terms of the ecosystem across the board. And of course, one thing when we talk about like the rise of Asia in global art, a lot of it, we also have to talk about basically China as the new sort of powerhouse. And it has certain similarities with India, but yet it diverged in particular kind of ways. The most obvious is, of course, after the 2008 financial meltdown, which affected, all sort of art scenes. In contrast to India, in China, you see that also that the contemporary scene has recovered much faster, and the recovery is much more broader based. You see exhibitions continuing not just in China, but internationally. I think that's very sort of distinctive. And China as an art scene is really interesting because, you realize that when contemporary art, as we know it, Chinese contemporary art first started, from the late 80s, the 90s, but especially hitting a kind of a big boom around 99, 2000, with the Shanghai Biennial and other sort of events, and what was happening, when Cai Guoqiang won the award in Venice, and Zhang Xiaogang, all those big names of that first 89 avant-garde, new wave sort of came about, was that one, you have a kind of scene that essentially had more than 1,000 years, millenniums of internal collecting. That you had an imperial collection, but you also had people who were collecting, but they were collecting their own art. So the collecting tradition of art is very, very strong, and especially among what the class we call the literati. class. But modern and contemporary art, essentially, I think when it first started, it was more collected by non-Chinese, you know, collected by foreigners in China and later, you know, outside China. Internal collecting, you know, followed sort of that, but which meant that when, you know, it really got into its groove by the 90s and 2000s, you already had within the sort of national art scene a huge pool of people who, you know, had a long tradition of systematically collecting their own art, you know, as a kind of expression of their culture. So that's quite you know, the story is very interesting in that sense. You know, they started collecting back their own culture. And we are reaching this situation where now, you know, the collecting by Chinese inside China is also driving the scene. It's not about, you don't have, you know, overseas Chinese driving the collecting of, especially of modern and contemporary art scenes necessarily. You have them in concert. That means you have, you know, people outside China and people inside China collectively doing that. I think for other art scenes, you know, even with the Indian art, is a little more kind of restricted. And the other main thing is, of course, what we're seeing now is very clear that there is a kind of multipolar world happening as far as Asian art is concerned. Because after China, places like Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, for instance, you are seeing these scenes coming on into the world stage. And you see this in institutions, in the fact that, you know, Tate recently, you know, also has started formally, you know, collecting Southeast Asian art, certainly along with Indian art. One remembers that the Guggenheim initiative also had India with Southeast Asia. I mean, there's a lot of issue with that, but I think the sign is that, you know, there are other scenes coming up, notably Southeast Asia. So you are getting a kind of multipolar kind of scene exploding. So the question is, of course, how is any one scene, or the players in any one scene, like, for example, here we're talking about India, how are we participating in this sort of broadening of interest in art across Asia, you know? And in places like Indonesia and Singapore, in China, certainly you're beginning to see the rise of what is called transnational collecting. That means collectors who are not collecting by country, they're collecting across the board, collecting, you know, across Pan-Asia, or they're collecting internationally, because that information is now freely available. You know, one can collect internationally, and that seems to be a kind of new interest, particularly for the new generation of collectors and as well.
So Boon Hui, how does that work then? So that's a really interesting sort of end of what you were talking about, and the idea that there has suddenly been explosions on, say, especially through Southeast Asia. That's sort of the fastest growing collecting community, and you know, it's certainly you know, getting on the map. Can you tell us why that is happening? Why was it so quick? Why was it so explosive? Who are the people who are buying? And this idea of transnational collecting, you know, it's exciting, but it also, how does that then relate with people collecting their own art? I mean, does it complement? How is it in competition to? How does that work? Can you give us
I
some
don't think
insight?
it's competition. You know what I'm talking about? I think it's a kind of new emerging trend, but you see this clearly, you know, in China. You just go to the private museums in China. For example, if you go to Shanghai, to the Long Museum, you can see the collection is transnational. You know, they have Chinese, American, and, you know, African art, Asian art. I haven't seen an Indian piece yet, but you see a kind of, that's what a kind of comparative collecting. I think that's very new, and it's great. And I begin to see that with some, collectors. If you're in Southeast Asia, it's a little bit easier because you can start always by collecting the region, collecting the various countries in the region, and you do see that particularly with
Can I just quickly ask Shruti? Shruti, can you open the presentation? Let's go through the first few slides, and Boon Hui can show us some Southeast Asian artists. Sorry, Boon Hui, we'll slide through while you're telling us about it. Okay. So yeah.
Okay.
Of course, is.
Okay. This is Zhao Wuji. Okay. And then the other thing is, I think the other thing with this transnational collecting is, of course, the importance of, firstly, diasporic artists, who are artists that are already out of a national art scene, which means, in certain circumstances, they have their work has been exposed both to collectors from their origin culture as well as outside, so people like Zhao Wuji, of course, and with China, there are three sort of artists: Zhao Wuji, Zhu Dequn, Chang Yu. There may be one or two more, but these three are very well known, who are, the sort of diasporic artists who have been in Paris. I mean, just like Razar and a couple of our Indian friends, So Zhao Wuji is interesting because in art history, he belongs both to, in a sense, modernism, Chinese modernism, but he's also very much part of the French lyrical expressionists, because he is, the artist that's collected by the French presidents, like Mitterrand. The family collects him a lot. Can we go to the next slide? Just show some examples of, okay, this is Zhao Wuji. Next slide, please. Chang Yu, the other sort of artists. Of course, take a look at the sort of prices we're talking about. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. And this is Chang Yu, and we must remember these, among these three, they are incredibly and deeply sort of collected across the board, not just by Chinese, but by, overseas Chinese, and collected by the West. And so on. They are in museums. The Metropolitan, the MoMA, the Guggenheim all have, a Zhao Wuji, for instance. So of the three, of course, Zhao Wuji is the sort of superstar. I mean, in 2018, a piece was sold for 65 million. So the ceiling is much much-higher than for other types of art, than other sort of art scenes. So but these three, they have been very famous and well collected before 2000. But I think what has happened is because of their exposure to a large sort of transnational collecting scene, when the boom really happened, they really rode that sort of wave, And the other thing is, of course, because of their large transnational exposure, they are very deeply sort of represented in the major institutions in Asia, in Europe, and in America. Like I said, Zhao Wuji, when we did, the Asia Society, when I was at Asia Society, we did the first show of Zhao Wuji in 40 years. And one of the things we noticed was that there was a lot of Zhao Wuji in private collections in America, because he was extremely well collected many decades ago. And with the recent boom in Asia, it's a kind of revival,
So this is sort of the modernist generation. You made a very interesting conversation, which I thought was very relevant to India, and which is something that I feel like our field is suffering from. You said that, sort of in Asia, there's a very healthy contemporary space, and the growth of the art ecosystem happens through contemporary. That is kind of like the litmus test of a healthy art ecosystem, because you know, in order to grow your collecting base, you need to grow your artists. So can you tell us a little bit about the contemporary scene in Asia and how that is developing in
It's very vibrant. I mean, in many ways, India is slightly sort of different. So just keep that in your mind. I think one is a kind of, I suppose, almost a conceptual question, and I may be a little controversial here, but you know, for any art scene to grow, one cannot depend, frankly, on dead artists, on the moderns, you know, because you need the contemporary, because you need for the scene to keep expanding beyond the national borders, to have, you know, exhibitions and collecting and circulation, sale, publication of artists from the scene. You need the contemporary artists because you need a continually expanding supply of art that is ever evolving. So in the long term, any scene, you know, that aims to be transnational, you need the contemporary artists. Also, frankly, because you will find, and I'm sure there are examples even in India, you will find that even among old collecting families, the children, you know, the who inherit that collection, they have completely different tastes. You know, you see this in the West across all art forms. That's the reason why Western opera is so sort of always facing a lot of challenges, for example, in places like New York, because the old families that would support that, their children, they have different tastes. They cannot take 4-hour operas, for instance. You know, they take shorter, much more experimental operas. So the same thing, I think, is happening, that you know, even old collecting families, the children have different tastes, you know, because they grew up in a different sort of, well, a transnational and global world. So they want to see and be seen and enjoy art that reflects the reality of their world, that they grew up in a kind of pan-Asian, a kind of global kind of world where the West and Asia, all of Asia, sort of exists. And I think that's a really sort of important thing. Later, I think we can talk about one other strand of it, which is about, you know, diversity and minority art, art from minority communities.
can we have the presentation again and move through the next couple of slides, because we'll see examples of contemporary output from Asia, which is really
That's
broadly
the ink.
yeah. So the next four or so slides, you know, you can sort of loop through. One thing that I wanted to say is here you're seeing, so for example, this is the Smart Museum in Chicago. You're definitely seeing a lot of sort of Western or global institutions sort of embracing more contemporary art. This is, of course, ink. You'll tell us something about this, Boon Hui.
Yeah. So, you know, I think with not to keep talking about China, but I think, you know, as the scene matures, what you're also seeing is, you know, the transnational art scene, global collecting, also creates space for artistic styles and traditions that normally do not you know, get much airspace, and they are seen as sort of local rather than global, you know. So we are seeing, you know, as for example, China, you know, becomes, you know, really, you know, one of the second, third, you know, largest art sort of market and art scene, not just a market, but also in production of scene. You're beginning to see them, you know, the scene being confident enough to look at its own indigenous tradition and push that out to the world as a worthy part, you know, of what people should look at, of the global contemporary. And ink, painting, contemporary ink, I think will be, you know, one of China's great contributions to the global art debate. And when we talk about ink, we are also talking about Japan, Korea, we're talking about Southeast Asia, places Singapore, you know, for example, where you have diasporic Chinese artists who have immigrated and created great traditions. And what you're seeing really is a kind of, in the last 10 years, a kind of maturation of this tradition. I mean, the reality is Western art history cannot absorb ink. They sort of try and describe it as a kind of a new form akin to abstract expressionists. I mean, how boring is that? Because, culturally it never came from that. It's a wholly sort of indigenous tradition of East Asia. But you are getting these incredible works, that are getting a lot of notice. And as a collector or a curator, I'm a curator, you would be silly not to take note of this. So this is Lao Tong Li, an ink painter from Guangzhou, from southern China. And this is a commission that I commissioned for the Asia Society Triennial. It's on exhibit until the end of January. If you're in New York, do go and take a look at it. And it's an extraordinary work. It's an enormous work. It's 2.5 meters by 4 meters long in 3 panels. It's ink and mineral color on silk. Yes, it's actually on silk. It's not on paper or canvas. I mean, it's an incredible artistic achievement. So things like that, I think, it's very interesting artistically and curatorially, and it really is a kind of new space that is being created. And all this comes from the fact that we're living in a world where now, one can collect. If one expands one's reach, one can curate exhibitions and collect, transnationally in niches, that still have great room to grow. You're not like competing in the same sand box.
Could we see the next slide, Arushi? I think we want to. I think we've explored this really well, and I now want to move to the moment that's happening in the West here. Okay, so these are a few more artists that you can tell us about.
Okay.
The next.
And let me say a little bit of Chong Su Ping. So, it's very interesting because after China, it is, of course, Southeast Asia that is really sort of expanding. And we see this also, as I mentioned before, in even in the West and Europe and America, increasing institutional interest. Places like LACMA, for instance, working with Bouditek, but they've also had LACMA has a big focus on contemporary, on ink, actually. They're trying to build ink as well as contemporary art from Asia, but specifically China. But you're seeing also from Southeast Asia, admittedly, Chong Su Ping really being a kind of, literally almost like coming out from I mean, this is an artist from Singapore, a tiny little kind of dot, but it's an artist that really is now part of the staple of regional collecting. Wherever you are in Southeast Asia, this will be one of the artists that you're collecting, and regularly in a very short space of time. He's hitting like $1 million at auction, for instance, very easily. But I think, it's very interesting in this aspect to see this new emerging scene literally, galloping at your back. Next slide. Could we go to the next slide? And with the contemporary, I was talking about contemporary. Christine Aijo, again, whom I'm showing, an artist of Chinese descent, but from Indonesia, hence the spelling of the name, an extractionist, an artist, promoted by, carried by White Cube and Ota. It's really fascinating how she has emerged as, a force to be reckoned with, and the visual language, as you can see in the work, is very intense, but it could be, an artist from anywhere in Asia. There is a kind of portability and transferability in the art, but really, a kind of, in terms of the artistic vision, very, very strong and intense sort of artist, and really she is, you know, one of the kind of banner carriers from Southeast Asia, from Indonesia. So you're beginning to see these kind of, and as well as contemporary, relatively young artists like Christine Ijo, you know, coming up, you know, and pushing out Southeast Asia as a new, like, look at me, this is, and all that has been driven by, in a sense, great support from the entire sort of ecosystem to get the work into institutions and so on. So, you know, the Asia Society has an enormous, a very major diptych by Christine Ijo, which was gifted to us when I was there by two Indonesian collectors who were very passionate about getting you know, their artists into, you know, important collections in the West. And I think that's very important because they've learned, actually, with the Southeast Asians, I think they've also learned from the Chinese how to build the reputation. They've, you know, asked to sit on committees, sit on boards, for instance, you know, sit on acquisition committees. They've gone out there, they've supported publications of catalogs, they've given work, they've given money in institutions across the board. So the reality is, you know, for me as a curator, it's quite relatively, you know, more painless to think about showing an artist, you know, from China or from Southeast Asia, certainly from Indonesia, from Singapore, because I know there will be a lot of support, both, you know, monetary and non-monetary at various levels if I were to present, you know, those kinds of artists.
Can we have the next slide, please? So now, yeah, so now hang on here. Thank you. Now I want to move kind of to what I think was precipitated from America. We, you know, going back to this idea that the pandemic created a lot of disruptions. And within these last 6 months, we've seen some huge socio-political movements happen. And a focus, you know, just a global focus on minority voices. You know, both Boon Hui and I live in New York, and I certainly lived through the heart of the Black Lives Matter movement here when, you know, that African American was killed. That 9-minute video kind of, I think, changed the fabric of America. It just left everybody stunned and kind of amalgamated people here in a way. You know, we've had this moment before. We've had the Rodney King riots in the 90s. At the various moments, there's a lot of outrage, but this one was especially transforming in terms of, you know, kind of like the social engagement around it. And we are seeing that trickling into the art ecosystem. So, for example, one of the things that Boon Hui and I do is, you know, we'll go and see the previews at Phillips and, you know, the general previews of contemporary, not like a specific region, but contemporary. Can we go back to the slide? Keep the slide, please. And we are seeing an increase of Black artists being collected. Kara Walker, which was on that slide, if we could go back to that slide, is one of them. Boon Hui, can you speak to this sort of moment of what's happening with this, you know, here in America, around minority voices, around, you know, diasporic voices?
Yeah, I think we're in a kind of interesting moment. Certainly these things were not caused by the pandemic. They are sort of accelerated and magnified by it. But we're beginning to see, you know, an increasing interest across the board, including with institutions, you know, including with institutions, the museums, the art centers, not just in fact, the commercial sector is sort of following in its wake, but really, you know, essentially the museum scene where, you know, I think, you know, America is very interesting as one of the, you know, as the largest market. there is an increasing sort of sensitivity to the ethics of art, to, you know, what art represents and who is represented in the imagery of art. So we're, you know, in the wake of BLM, of Black Lives Matter, and, you know, we see the sort of persecution and intolerant xenophobia against Asian Americans as a result of COVID. Again, this is nothing new. After 9/11, you know, Muslims were the subject of much xenophobic attacks in the US. But here is, for the first time, we are seeing it spill over into art, because and it's primarily, you know, first an issue of social justice and an issue of ethics. Basically, that you know, can our art reflect America better? So hence we see the increasing interest in Black art, in art now, you know, by people of color, and particularly women, and including, you know, women artists of color. And also, you know, personally, that was the reason why, one of the reasons behind the thinking of putting somebody like our Peter Singh that I did for the triennial, because, you know, as a senior woman artist of color, you know, the work really speaks. Her work, even though, you know, she's over 80, she's been producing great work for a long time. But this is the moment, you know, when somebody like that, a great artist, you know, of course you must be a great artist first, but the moment sort of comes. And it's interesting that, you know, after I put her in the Asia Society, in the Triennial in New York, you know, now she's announced that she's going to Gwangju, which is the biggest sort of biennial in the whole of Asia. So, you know, the interest now in minority art from minority communities, Black art. Can we move on to the next slide? And you're seeing this again, I emphasize also with institutions. It is not a commercial kind of movement only. Therefore, we know that the change is perhaps very deep. Of course, with painting, Kerry James Marshall was really the sort of pioneer, and that incredible retrospective. Next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, next slide.
Martin Wong.
Oh, and then what's interesting is, you know, the spilling over from just Black art into other sort of marginalized voices. And that is the interesting thing that's happening, that I think, you know, is happening in America. It's happening, you know, to a lesser extent in Europe, and it's going to be a kind of big trend, I think, that is happening. And really it's about, again, I emphasize, it is about answering the question of, you know, what is, in the context of America, what is the image, the imagery, and who gets represented when we talk about art in America. And Martin Wong, you know, an artist, you know, of both, you know, Chinese and Latinx descent, you know, who is very associated with the New York avant-garde, the Lower East Side, places like Harlem, you know, who passed away due to AIDS. And but he was named, he in his cowboy outfit. Next slide. I think you did have a photo of him. So he always was like the cowboy, you know, the Asian, the Latinx cowboy, very much part of the New York downtown avant-garde, you know, in the 80s. And he is having a kind of moment right now, you know, with, you know, he had a major retrospective in New York, and after that, it just went from strength to strength. So, and you know, as an LGBTQ artist, you know, who died of AIDS, you know, but who was very close to the Latinx and Black community as well, you know, the artistic community in those areas, he is having a kind of moment, and it's just illustrative of what you know, one of the trajectories. It's not the only one, but it's one of the interesting trajectories where now, you know, people are looking for these voices that were silenced, that were marginalized, and bring them to the center, to the heart of museums, to the heart of biennials, triennials, to the heart of gallery exhibitions and critical writing. Next slide.
Next slide.
So this is a moment that is sort of happening, you know, and the latest, I think Priyanka has also talked to me about this, is somebody like Salman, a much younger artist who just had a small sort of show, is showing at the Whitney, suddenly having his kind of moment, you know, and this is part of this moment right now where, you know, people are looking for minority voices, and particularly, you know, marginalized and silenced voices.
I wanted to just take a moment to talk about Salman because this is a product of South Asia. And I wanted to, I mean, Salman is somebody I've actually known since he graduated from Pratt, and I'm going to say it here, I actually found him at Pratt, and then he showed at Icon for 3 or 4 years, but has completely exploded on the contemporary scene in America. He was just signed by Lurig Augustine. Can we go back to the slideshow, please? Just want to show some of the images. Thank you. Can we go to the next slide? So he essentially is he's a gay Pakistani who lives between Lahore and New York, and has caught the fancy of sort of the Western collecting community in the way that I have never seen any South Asian do. So, you know, we can talk about Subodh, we can talk about Rashid Rana, you know, but they held moments in terms of like when they were kind of like, it's sort of people were really chasing their work. With Salman, it's early days, so he is having a show at the Whitney right now. But when you go into the Whitney and you walk through and see who's collected, you know, they'll say in the collection of, they're all Western collectors, and you know, we have to wait and see. But my instinct very much is that he is going to sort of, you know, have staying power in terms of like, you know, somebody who everybody's interested in. I have to, you know, I am the commercial person in the duo here, and I come from the auction world. But you know, he has a 4-year waiting list at his gallery, and recently his prices at Phillips, works of his that were sold at Icon for maybe like $20,000-$30,000, if that, sold for $500,000, $520,000 in a space of 3 weeks, and a painting just sold in London for $822,000. So like, just people are chasing his work. It's crazy. And I think he fits this kind of, you know, he's a really great artist. I mean, he's a wonderful painter, but he's also kind of like this minority voice that is telling interesting stories around the fringes, which is what is, I think it's this marriage that's captured this moment. So he's quite interesting. Can we go to the next slide, please? I wanted to also sort of, when we kind of talk about Chitra Ganesh, you want to, and thanks, thank Renu for the image here, because I'll put a shout out to Gallery Espace, but maybe we can talk about, yeah.
Yeah, just to, you know, we put Chitra here just to say that, you know, it also has to do with moment. And somebody like Salman, I think is fitting into the current kind of moment. So there's a kind of shrewdness to the timing, whether conscious or unconscious, you know, that he is coming on to the scene in a kind of moment when the scene is looking for certain kinds of categories. But certainly it's not a new phenomena. That there is a great community of South Asian artists in Singapore, in New York, for instance, and somebody like Chitra Ganesh, whom I've shown, is quite sort of extraordinary. So I think, you know, it's whether it's talent, but it's also whether, you know, one is responding to particular moments, and it's the one is not the artist, but whether the ecosystem is responding to sort of, you know, what's happening in that moment, you know, and there is a particular kind of search for minority, silenced, marginalized voices by people of color, artists of color, that is sort of going on. And we don't want to be too mercenary about it. And certainly one should not rely purely on, you know, commercial or auction prices. That would be the biggest disaster. That's what got Indian contemporary art to its current sort of situation in '08. You know, I think the whole thing has to come together. There also has to be also, you know, a kind of institutional and critical sort of backup. But suffice to say, there is a moment happening. The question is whether one or that scene is actually pushing out or responding to that moment, you know. Right now I can see, you know, after, you know, after a scene like China, internationally, Southeast Asia really is sort of on a kind of aggressive upward swing, you know, and you see a few other, certainly art from artists based in Africa is very much sort of on kind of, you know, rise.
So we're done with the presentation. Arushi, if you want to put us back, I know you have this urge to put us on the screen. Boon Hui, I want to now pull it back.
Yeah, so since then,
I want to pull it back to India and our ecosystem here. I've always incredibly enjoyed speaking to you because you seem to have, you're one of the rare few people I know that really has kind of a pan world lens to art, where you really do deep dives into different parts of the world and have this especially strong background in Asia. We owe the Progressive Revolution show, which I think was just, you know, a watershed show in recent history about setting up the foundations of modernism for people to understand. And so in a sense have like kind of become a specialist yourself of South Asian art. Can you contextualize for us the Indian ecosystem? What are the things that we need to be thinking of? How can we encourage? I mean, we are vastly behind the rest of Asia in terms of everything, you know, critical thinking, maybe academic writing, you know, even sort of developing our own collectors. Can you give us some roadmaps and guidance in terms of what you think we should be focusing on in our space?
I think the present company is much more qualified than I am. I can only speak as a kind of observer and basically, you know, a curator of Asian art in terms of, you know, I think the question, it's more helpful in terms of, you know, I think the questions that people should be looking at right now is sort of, you know, what is this current moment? What is the role of art in this current moment? And, you know, how do we want to represent our own, wherever you are, you know, your own sort of art scene? I will use a non-Indian example. One of the collateral exhibitions of the Triennial, in fact, the only major one, there are two major ones, sorry. So one of the major ones was I got a proposal from the New York Historical Society, which actually is the oldest art museum in New York. It is not the Met. And many of the masterpieces of, you know, modern American art and like the Hudson River paintings and so on are actually in the collection. The Audubon and so on are actually in the collection of the New York Historical Society. And there was their new curator of American art, who is from Hawaii, okay, already marginalized, and she's not white. You know, her called Wendy Ikamoto, was very interesting, and she wanted to do a show about representing, visualizing America and American art. What is American art? And she wanted to include Asian art in that, to make a kind of very bold statement that this display of American art needs to have non-white faces, because as she says, you know, how many blonde you know, portraits can you put and call that, you know, the history of American art? So the show that is on now until, you know, at least the middle of next year is really interesting. I urge everyone to go and see it. And the catalog is coming out. I have a text in that catalog. The show is called Dreaming Together. And I think it speaks of this, a response to this moment on the part of an art curator, you know, to say that if dreaming together, it means that this show that is meant to represent the imagery of American art must have some diversity. It has Black images, it has, you know, yellow images, you know, Asian alongside it has, you know, native images of Native Americans inside. So it's making a statement, a very bold statement about this moment in time, and throwing it back at this sort of master narrative of a white American art history. I think things like that are very important. So I think that's a kind of barometer of, you know, one of the things that some people in the global art world are looking at. I think one should ask ourselves, you know, where do I stand in that? Where does where do the artists that I love stand in that? What can I do with that? And, you know, going back to the first point, we started with this thing about transnationalism, and one of the reasons is certainly not monetary, is that sometimes when we see other artists not from our own artistic tradition, it changes the lens of which we look at our own sort of art. So, you know, this kind of comparative curating is quite, I think, increasingly important, if at all, to, you know, humble ourselves, you know, because if we are our frog in our own well, no matter how big the well, is still a well. There's a world outside the well, you know. So this moment is very interesting. Also, it's a very educational moment and learning moment for all of us, to force us out of our own, you know, well, to look at, you know, diversity within our own culture, who has been marginalized. I got a message, interestingly, about what about the women artists, some of, especially those that are married to famous male artists. But certainly this is the question that is being going on. You know, where are the artists that deserve to be seen? You know, who for whatever reason has not been, which are the art scenes that are interesting, that we have not really had an opportunity?
I want to dig deeper because I don't feel like I got my question answered. Okay, so the heart of there are sort of various heart points in an ecosystem, and of course the art making, the artist is at the center of it. But that, you know, the ecosystem around it needs to support that art creation, which includes, you know, visionary gallerists, it includes good writing, but it also, frankly, to sustain, requires passionate and dedicated collectors who are not speculators. Do you have any thoughts around how we can develop our collecting community? You know, what are the things that will help engage and keep them connected to us, and continuing to support the art?
I think one needs to build as broad a collecting community as possible. So it's always I think for any scene, it's always very critical to always have a generation of new collectors coming on, but one must realize that each generation is very different. Right? I think we said that point earlier when we were talking about opera. I think one of the things that we've learned from the 2008 meltdown, and I'm sure, you know, the Indian scene finds some relevance, is never ever to build a collecting based on investment value. or asset value. If that is your first and only reason, the scene is very, very sort of fragile. You need to balance that with a kind of very tough and vibrant assessment and discussion of artistic value, and now we know in this moment also a kind of ethics of art, who needs to be, who deserves to be seen. So I think the jux of it is education is very, very important, but a kind of also education that is led by what is the value of the art that cannot be represented by, number of crores per square inch, which only the Indians seen at a certain point in the history. You see newspapers talking about that, Hussein is how many crores per inch, Tayyip is how many crores an inch. I've never seen any crores. Okay. Speaking in US dollars, I've never seen any scene in the public mass media talk about an artist in terms of the dollars per square inch, only the Indian art scene. And I think that is sort of a kind of indicative of what are the kind of driving forces. And that is a very sort of unstable kind of situation. One must remember, for example, even in this moment, a Black artist like Kerry James Marshall, he has had a long career, long career, as you see in his retrospective. The works go on for many he's been painting for many decades, and slowly, the thing has sort of, he got to this moment in time when the moment, his work just speaks to the moment. But he is an artist that has been working and been collected for a long period of time. So you need both, you need both the sort of discussion and critical dialogue on aesthetic value and artistic value alongside, the more commercial aspects. The two need to go together.
Yeah, I love that point, Boon Hui, because I think that's what I feel like we need to do more, is to go back to the basics and talk about the aesthetics and the politics and, sort of the inherent, when we represent art. And I think most of the audience here, we're inside, I think mostly we're insiders. And sort of, especially for, artists that are living, whose work continues to evolve, we kind of have to see ourselves as spokespersons for them, for their worldview, and helping people step in and understand the work. I have that was all my questions, and I know that I'm mindful of time. So Boon Hui, thank you very much. I'm going to pop it back to Sharon, but I will say, Sharon, Saloni sent me a question privately, and I know you're going to handle the question answers, but I can
Why don't you go ahead? Go ahead, give the question and answer it, please.
Okay, so here's Saloni.
Before that, can I just make one short point? I think one of the things that's very important in promoting art scene is actually access to critical writing and catalogs of the artists. I mean, the reason why sometimes some artists are less circulated is simply because it's impossible to get any information, any sort of critical information about an artist's work, across time, So it's also not much use printing catalogs if they are never circulated. Nobody knows how to do that. So I highly encourage, one practical suggestion, that even if the galleries, are doing it, if you have a catalog, have a think about who are the people internationally, that would be interested in this work, and send them the catalog, have access to them, because it is extraordinarily difficult to get a lot of good information on artists in emerging regions a lot of times.
I wanted to add to that point. This is something that I have really struggled with in even my own education of my my art that I represent, because I found that writing, critical writing around art has been very inaccessible for me. Um, because there will be catalogs and books that are written about artists that, are historic. I mean, I'm gonna ruffle some feathers here. But when you read it and you walk away and ask yourself, did you understand it? Did it make sense to you? I have to say I struggle. So we need to move away from this sort of emperor has no clothes kind of writing with flowery language. And when we write about an artist, it has to be as simple as, that light was bright. Everybody here understands what that means. It's simple language, and so that, confusion about an artist's work doesn't hide behind flowery language. And that's what I think is really important, is when we're thinking about presenting our artists and inviting writers to write, we have to invite writers who can really, in very simple language, tell us what we're seeing and help us do that. Otherwise, I mean, if I can't understand it, and I've spent 20 years in the art world, how are you expecting a person who's, just developing as a collector to connect with the art? We have to make that is so critical. The quality of the writing around, the artists that we're representing. I'm going to go to Saloni's question. What do you attribute Salman's success to? Maybe gay and Asian, which is a current wave, it seems, in the West. Also, I feel artists from Asia get a lot more recognition in the West if they move their base from India. Do you think that's true? Also, China already being big on the international scene. Where do you put India? There are a handful of Indian artists that are recognized in the West, sadly. Boon Hui, you want to comment on some of those questions?
I do a general answer. One is the reality, as a curator, it's much easier to do an exhibition on a contemporary artist from China than it is to do one on an artist from India. That's just, I mean, the actual reality I faced, simply because there are less sort of avenues of support, and we're not just talking about money, but various things that are needed to produce an exhibition. And I think by now, with Chinese art, the scene has matured, and it's a full ecosystem. So when you want to find out about artists, there are many people that will rally around, including, of course, people that say, how much do you need? We're gonna make it sort of happen for you. One cannot afford to ignore that, because in America, the museums rarely have substantial government funding. So it's all privately sort of raised. It's always just much easier. I think with an artist like Salman, I don't want to sort of single him out, but I think there is something about the current moment that one is, of course, it must be like a good artist. So he certainly is a good painter. You can't kind of deny that. But there is a kind of moment that is happening now, I think, that we've discussed before, with artists of color and minority voices, and the fact that there are not that many LGBTQ artists actively sort of out there. I think certainly is an advantage. It can't be the only reason, but it is an advantage. Probably Priyanka can say a little bit more on that part. But artistically, it is, he is an interesting artist also because, as a Western viewer, you can comprehend the work because he clearly is having a kind of dialogue with certain imagery in the Western, particularly the European tradition. He's very big on the European tradition. So if you read the reviews, you will see every critic, I'm not sure why every critic doesn't mention it. It was the thing that struck out to me, always throws up some European kind of name when they talk about Salman's kind of work. That's worth thinking about, I think.
No, that's an interesting question. Now I know I have one more thing I might want to explore, but Sharon, you'll tell me, you can cut me off when I'm ready.
No, no, go ahead, because this is really very riveting. It is all about the connection and the engagement that we're talking about. And sure, clearly in India, we're lagging behind in a lot of things. And like you're pointing out, so go ahead, please.
Okay.
I don't want to stop you.
I wanted to, a critical part of the ecosystem also is institutional support for our, for our artists. Um, Unfortunately, in India, we don't have a developed museum system, but that was very much the case in China too, where, there weren't you and I have had this conversation where you're like, the Chinese national museums were just like the NGMA. You could rent out the space. There wasn't any kind of, governmental structure. Yet now we're at a point where there's a proliferation of museums in China. So I wanted to understand how that happened. The second question is the engagement with Western museums. We see very activist kind of collectors, right? From China and from the West who the collectors demand to be, they're activist collectors. They demand to be on the boards. When they're on the boards, they demand to have their artists shown. And that is, I think, another space where I think we need to do a little bit more work in getting our collectors to step up and be more activist in a sense. Can you speak to those 2 points?
I think what some of these scenes, China and increasingly Southeast Asia, has learned is that you need to lift the entire scene. The whole bar needs to lift. So you start to move away from, I support this because you are showing a painting from me, or I want to write a check to support this because this is an artist that I support. I think what is happening is across the board. One, of course, a country like China, you have more collectors. You literally have more collectors. This idea that when the whole scene, the whole Chinese or Southeast Asian or Indonesian scene lives, everybody sort of benefits. So, there is this, I think, this kind of understanding. It's not so transactional and limited to what do I get out of it. Because in the latter, you cannot actually move the entire scene that easily. You get pinpricks, and what you see with Chinese art is, their international presence is also, as you noted, boasted by how aggressively and broadly they've entered all the boards and committees. It's the checkbook comes with it, certainly, of major museums, not just in the West, but in other parts of Asia, whether you have a biennial, triennial, or you're doing a retrospective survey. Because I think the dictum is, if you don't show people that you are backing your own art scene, how are people supposed to have faith in your art scene, when you are not even showing, not that you have faith in the works that you own, but faith in your art scene. I mean, someone needs to take the flag and wave it in people's faces. Who's going to wave the flag for you? You need to sort of do that. And I think that's really sort of important at this moment in time, the moment in time when people are looking for new niches for diversity, for minority voices. Is an opportunity, but it's also a wave that you could miss. It will move along, like I said. That's why, China, now you see Southeast Asia aggressively coming on. The Tate, is looking aggressively at Southeast Asia as people, build on this wave of transnational collecting. And I urge, all my friends in India, you need to take your flag and wave it in our faces. Whether we like it or not, it's our problem. It's not your problem. But if, you don't go out and wave it, that's the only way in which the needle will shift. And what we want is not specific artists. What we want is the entire scene the confidence in the entire scene to sort of move, you know. So go into the institutions, go into the non-profit art centers, sort of elsewhere. And at the same time, I think I always say, you know, because I've been doing a lot of international work, don't be seduced by brand names. You know, don't be seduced by New York and London or Paris, because sometimes, you know, people that will move your scene for you do not come from these cities nor these institutions. Go for the people that will that will run the marathon for you, not the sprinters. The sprinters will tire up and give you up, you know. So it's very sort of interesting. So I will say, you know, because I've experience in running a festival in France, you know, there is Paris, but you know, when we also did the exhibition in Lyon and in the border city of Lille, you know, boy, more curators turned up there than in Paris, because in Paris it was like, you know, we were at the Palais de Tokyo, but there's 100 other museums that they could go to. But you know, in these other places, we found the impact was much stronger. So I think we need to be a little kind of clever in seizing the opportunity and not shutting the doors to wherever it is, you know. In Asia, I will say, you know, and and it's not entirely, I'm just waving the flag that, you know, an exhibition in Singapore is very important because it's, you know, the English speaking city in that region, and it is the next region, big sort of art production and collecting region. And Singapore in Southeast Asia is the exhibition city, you know. Most major exhibitions, you know, of that regional art open at some point in Singapore. So I think that's really sort of interesting to mull over. I think in this moment in time, it's a very important moment now. I think we need to seize upon it.
I think this is great advice. This is fantastic advice, Boon Hui.
It's not advice, just a kind of idea.
No, it's just like you've like dropped it on us, like, come on, you Indians, get on with it. So we have to. It's just great.
Sharon, there's one more question, but I'll leave it to you to figure out.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Why don't you go ahead? We still have a few people listening to us, and the people who matter are here. So come on, go ahead.
Okay, so Tariq just sent me a question. What is the role and responsibility of Indian galleries, and is it different from galleries in more mature markets?
I think that's a Priyanka question. Okay, I will make one point, which is that, you know, again, the ecosystem focus. I think the ecosystem matters, the entire scene. So whatever, you know, even commercial entities like galleries, well, like this TAP platform is a superb example of that, you know, of lifting, of galleries coming together also, and galleries to lift the scene. So I think, you know, not just competition, but the idea of what galleries can do to collaborate to lift the entire scene is extraordinarily important. I can't emphasize that sort of enough. It's extraordinarily important at this moment.
Sharon, I think we have to stop somewhere, right?
So yes, we have to stop somewhere. And you know, whatever both of you have said has been so valuable and very interesting, because you've pulled us up. And yes, we have recognized a lot of things on our own too, about not having institutions, not having the government support. And it's all been private players. There have been very few institutions which have been very active. And I think it's time for more institutions, and it's time for us to step up and connect with the outside world. There are few who have done that. And also, I think we have to look at the margins. We have to look at other artists too, because a lot of them have a lot of important things to say. And like you said, the connection and the engagement becomes very important, and to tell the narrative, to tell the story, and to put it out there is definitely what we need to address right away. So all of us galleries have to wake up. All of us have to talk to the institutions, and we will be there soon. You can bet, Boon Hui. We'll all be waving our flags at you. So thank you, Boon Hui. That's so nice of you to have taken the time and talk to us from the heart, and talk to us so frankly. And Priyanka, you put this together, which is important for all of us. And this continues on, I mean, this is there on Facebook, it'll be on YouTube. So those who've missed it can definitely enjoy it. And I know our competition today has been Anthony Gromley at the KNMA. So we will have a lot of people listening to this recorded conversation. Thank you all. And thank you very, very much, listeners. See you all soon on our next event. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.